Welcome to the Literature Review presentation. My name is Oana Rus, and I'm a doctoral student in the Ed Leadership program at City University in the Advanced Research Topics class that Dr. Mary D teaches. In this presentation, I will describe the literature review and findings for my topic. I will start with explaining my topic, then talk about the literature review and purpose, discuss the proposed study and research question, explain key terms, theories, and major themes from the literature review. I will conclude with literature findings and recommendations that provide a need for my proposed study. My topic of study is minority students' sense of belonging and engagement, in particular narrowed down to staff efforts to alleviate isolation and disengagement for these students. There is ample research on why this is a problem, especially for minority students. The issue is important because in a primarily white institution, these students have often been discriminated against, disproportionately over-disciplined, were subjects to microaggressions, and teachers displayed deficit thinking regarding their abilities. Thus, their academic performance, motivation, and attendance were impacted, as shown in the study by Tanquera and Calmont in 2019. In the review, I will show why minority students' sense of belonging and engagement in a primarily white institution is a problem, and analyze existing literature about staff recommendations to remediate adverse effects. I will focus on how the topic has been researched so far and what are further recommendations, with an overarching goal of showing prior research leading up to my study. Thus, I want to build a solid argument based on literature gaps and recommendations. The study purpose. In the proposed study, I will look at staff perspectives regarding race and equity interventions to alleviate the disengagement and isolation for minority students. These interventions have not been entirely successful, and some staff were reluctant during trainings. The study will attempt to find ways to reach more of the faculty at the school. The research questions shown here are tailored to a qualitative approach, since my plan is to build an in-depth perspective on the equity interventions. The research questions are: what is it like for minority students in a primarily white institution to feel included from a staff perspective? What types of professional development are needed at this institution from a staff perspective? And what race and equity efforts are instrumental to minority students' sense of belonging and engagement also from a staff perspective? I am going to touch upon two theories: self-determination theory and critical race theory. Ryan and Edward Deci are established scholars on self-determination theory, and they connected this theory with the fundamental need to belong. They argued that by attuning to student needs and making them feel included, teachers could establish their pupils' emotional safety to investigate ideas, self-motivate, and challenge themselves. The fundamental need to belong was articulated by Maslow in 1943 as an essential requirement for the development of higher levels of knowledge, and was repeated in an article about learning and achievement by Brulesson and Thoron in 2014. Critical race theory emerged out of civil rights movement to support education work that acknowledged the marginalized voices of African Americans to counter racist or colorblind attitudes. The earliest work on CRT happened in the 70s, came from Derek Bell, which is considered one of the founders. In their book about CRT, Ladson, Billings, and Tate showed how multicultural education was not sufficient to erase the effects of racism in schools because it was rooted in an assimilationist, meritocracy-based perspective. Schools that adopted a CRT lens paid attention to dialogues and to the voices of people of color. My key terms are sense of belonging and engagement. For sense of belonging, the definition is derived from psychology, and Arsenal and Duro in 2017 recalled that it encompassed a student's perception of being respected, feeling important, and included. The authors argued the sense of belonging was associated with well-being and accomplishment, whereas being rejected was associated with feeling excluded, anxious, demoralized, and lower educational attainment. Regarding engagement, Jimerson and al. In 2003 revealed this concept also from a psychology background as multifaceted with cognitive, behavioral, and affective dimensions. When attempting to define student engagement in school for quantitative purposes, researchers meant it as caring about the topic, staying focused, working on the topic, and maintaining interest in learning. These key terms are also part of my literature themes. Other literature themes are minority students in a primarily white institution, cultural responsive practices, and professional development for staff. Two qualitative research studies, Hope et al. And Griffin et al., show students in a primarily white institution being marginalized, placed outside of the dominant culture, and teachers contributing to this problem, answering the literature's first question. The studies did not analyze positive teacher interventions or what would happen if teachers took note of Black and minority students' input. They just gave recommendations. The articles are relevant to my topic, highlighting race effect on school belonging for minority students in a primarily white institution, and providing background for the study's first research question. Cultural responsive practices. When researchers discuss cultural responsive practices, they show that student engagement and belonging for minority students are connected to these practices and curriculum choices. Teacher practice and attitudes without a cultural responsive lens can hurt students. Lack of sensitivity and knowledge about students' culture can produce harmful effects on engagement, school climate, and foster racial stereotypes. Professional development for staff can be targeted around equity efforts to raise belonging and engagement. Specific equity PD, such as complex instructions, cultural responsive practice, standards-based grading, as in the studies by Brown and Rodriguez and Rubel, can address cultural practices. The research quoted addresses the literature's purpose and questions. These studies are relevant as the chosen institution has a high majority of white staff members and many staff already took complex instruction PD. Several departments are using the practices in Rubel's study. This study was limited to resistant pre-service teachers. The Rodriguez study looked at teachers who were successful with all the practices but struggled to connect to minority students' real experiences. The PD efforts are covered by the third research question of the study. Other literature review themes are teacher-student relationship, TSR, building African-American students as leaders, and staff perspectives on PD equity efforts. A common theme across the Scales and Queen's article was the importance of positive teacher-student relationships, which connects to minority students' engagement and belonging, literature purpose, and the first question. Finding which specific changes improve TSR are recommendations included in my study, and address literature purpose and second question. The staff at the chosen institution has already received training on relationship and resilience and building positive teacher-student relationship. These techniques might benefit all students and will be addressed in the study and are covered by the second research question. The gaps outline recommendations for in-depth studies, follow-up for teacher practices, and larger samples. Building minority student leaders and considering their opinion matters when selecting professional development efforts, as shown in the recent research by Fenzel and Richardson and Lack and Bashley. Minority students become disengaged and feel othered when their opinion is not part of the school improvement. Teacher perspectives on equity efforts can gradually change, increase engagement, and can create an inclusive culture. Felton's research connects with the proposed study and the research questions because at the chosen institution, there are resistant teachers to equity interventions. These professionals need scaffolding and time for their journey towards understanding and embracing the equity work being done. In conclusion, sense of belonging impacts grades, educational attainment, and well-being for all students. Particular attention should be given to a sense of belonging for historically disadvantaged students because theirs is lower than their white counterparts. A quantitative approach on engagement and belonging does not follow through with the article recommendations, thus creating a gap and the need for a qualitative study, which is my proposed study. Several years of climate data at the chosen institution shows disproportionality in belonging for minority students. The proposed study follows through with the need to repair this difference in school belonging, and it is impacted by teacher attitudes. The adverse effects of disengagement lead to low performance, attendance issues, and dropout, but teachers can spark engagement with positive teacher-student relationships and instructional practices, especially for minority students. Teacher behaviors can be trained through school-wide professional development on equity, applying critical race theory in education, culturally responsive practices, and other instructional practices focused on equity. Teachers who plan equity professional development need to include the oppressed voices and be mindful of pervasive and dominant colonial views in their curriculum. Race and equity staff members at the chosen institution applied some of these techniques already. The proposed intervention is implementing many of the strategies from the studies, is focused on equity practices for teachers since they have the power to change disengagement and isolation. The resources presented show practices adopted at an institution, but the entire study encompasses all of these suggestions. Only two of the most recent studies focused on staff perspectives and their equity intervention, Myers and Felton. No study included all the PD and training at the chosen institution. The staff perspective and third research question focus on the most relevant PD and equity efforts, thus establishing a prioritized model. My future aims regarding the literature review process is to keep up with advances in the field, find new authors that are relevant to my topic, continue to organize and update my reference list, add other major themes, build connection, and strengthen my argument and the need for my study. In the next slides, I have attached the reference list. Thank you so much for listening.